The December wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal as Silas Granger descended from the Mongolian rim. His pack mule, loaded with beaver pelts and fox furs, picked its way carefully down the frost-covered trail. 3 winters had passed since Mary died of the fever. 3 winters of silence broken only by wind and wolf song. The solitude suited him fine, or so he told himself each morning when he woke to an empty cabin. The trading post at Willow Creek sat like a festering wound against the landscape, all warped timber and rusted tin. Silas had avoided it for months, preferring the cleaner establishment 30 miles east. But the storm clouds gathering over the northern peaks promised a blizzard that would trap him in the high country if he didn't resupply soon. He smelled the place before he saw it. Wood smoke mixed with rot-gut whiskey and unwashed men. 4 horses stood tethered outside, their breath steaming in the cold air. Silas tied his mule to the hitching post and shouldered through the door, the warmth hitting him like a physical presence. The scene inside stopped him cold. 4 men, drunk enough to sway on their feet, stood in a loose circle near the potbelly stove. Between them, kneeling on the plank floor with her hands bound behind her back, was an Apache woman. Her doe-skin dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing bruised skin beneath. Blood had dried at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes, those eyes held nothing but cold contempt as she stared straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge her captors. $20 silver, the largest man was saying, his words slurred with drink. Fresh widow, boys. Her buck got himself killed raiding down near Mercy's Bend. She's got strong hands for work and, he leered, other uses besides. Silas felt his jaw clench. He'd come for flour and powder, not this. The smart thing was to turn around, walk out, let these men conduct their vile business. But something in the woman's bearing, the rigid pride in her spine despite her circumstances, held him in place. $15, offered a thin man with a sparse beard. And I'll throw in a bottle besides. You couldn't afford her with 100 bottles. Jennings. The big man laughed. This one's quality. Look at her. Probably not even 25 winters on her. The woman's gaze shifted slightly, finding Silas where he stood by the door. For a heartbeat. Their eyes met. He saw no plea there, no hope, just a profound weariness, as if she'd already accepted whatever fate awaited. It was a look he'd seen before, in Mary's eyes near the end, when the fever had burned away everything but resignation. She got a name? Silas heard himself ask. The men turned, noticing him for the first time. The big man, Silas recognized him now as Jake Thornton, a sometimes trapper, full-time drunk, grinned, showing yellow teeth. Well, if it ain't the hermit of Mogollon. Come down from your mountain, have you? Thornton's grin widened. Her Apache name's something I can't wrap my tongue around, but you can call her whatever you like, once you pay up. Silas moved closer, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked. Up close, he could see the purple bruising along her jaw, the way she held herself perfectly still despite what must have been considerable pain. She understand English? Some, Thornton shrugged. Enough to know when you tell her to fetch wood or warm your bed. The casual cruelty of it made Silas's stomach turn. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The storm was coming faster than expected. How much? The words were out before he could stop them. Thornton's eyes lit up with greed. For you, Granger, let's say $30, or that fine stack of pelts on your mule. It was robbery, plain and simple. Those pelts represented months of work, his entire winter's take. They'd buy enough supplies to last until spring, maybe even leave some left over for ammunition and a new trap line. Silas looked at the woman again. She was studying him now, her dark eyes unreadable. A strand of black hair had escaped her bonds, hanging across her face. She made no move to shake it away. The pelts, he said quietly. Thornton whooped with delight. Boys, we got ourselves a deal. Jennings, go help Granger unload them furs. As the men busied themselves with his pelts, Silas knelt beside the woman. Up close, he could smell sage and wood smoke in her hair, see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and better times. When he reached for the ropes binding her wrists, she flinched, barely perceptible. But there. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said softly. She said nothing, but allowed him to work at the knots. Her wrists were raw where the rope had bitten deep. When the bonds fell away, she brought her hands forward slowly, rubbing feeling back into them. "You got a name?" he asked. For a long moment, she was silent. Then, so quietly he almost missed it. "Ayani." "Ayani," he repeated, the unfamiliar syllables awkward on his tongue. "I'm Silas. You'll need a coat. It's fixing to snow." He shrugged out of his buffalo robe and held it out. She looked at it, then at him, suspicion clear in every line of her body. But the temperature was dropping fast, and practicality won. She took the robe, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Well, I ain't that touching," Thornton said, returning with the last of the pelts. "You best get moving. Granger, that storm's going to be a real widowmaker." The irony wasn't lost on Silas. He stood, offering his hand to Ayani. She ignored it, rising on her own with a grace that belied her ordeal. Outside, the first fat snowflakes were beginning to fall. Silas loaded what supplies he could onto his mule, a meager haul without goods to trade. Ayani stood apart, the buffalo robe making her look small despite her straight-backed posture. "Can you ride?" he asked. She nodded once. He helped her onto the mule, then took the lead rope, 20 miles to his cabin. With a blizzard bearing down, they'd be lucky to make it before full dark. As they left the trading post behind, Silas glanced back once. Ayani sat rigid on the mule, staring straight ahead. He wondered what he'd done. What impulse had driven him to trade his winter's work for a woman who looked at him like he was just another captor? The snow fell heavier now, already beginning to obscure the trail. Silas pulled his hat low and leaned into the wind. Behind him, Ayani was a silent presence, as remote as the mountains themselves. They climbed in silence, the only sounds the mule's labored breathing and the creak of leather. The familiar landmarks disappeared one by one beneath the white curtain of snow. Silas knew these trails like his own scars, but even he felt a flutter of concern as the visibility dropped to mere yards. "There's a cabin," he said over his shoulder, raising his voice above the wind. "Another hour, maybe 2. No response. He hadn't expected one. The storm hit in earnest as they crossed Skeleton Ridge. The wind drove ice crystals into any exposed skin like tiny needles. Silas tucked his chin deeper into his collar and pressed on. The mule balked once, twice, but Silas coaxed it forward with gentle words and firm pressure on the rope. He almost missed the turn to his valley, the familiar lightning-struck pine nearly invisible in the white fury. But his feet knew the way, even when his eyes failed him. Down through the draws, across the frozen creek, up the final slope to where his cabin sat sheltered beneath a granite overhang. The structure looked even smaller than usual, half buried in drifting snow, but the roof was sound, the walls thick, and most importantly, there was seasoned wood stacked beneath the lean-to. Silas helped Ayani down from the mule. She stumbled slightly, her legs stiff from the cold ride, but caught herself before he could steady her. Together, they got the mule into the small stable attached to the cabin side. Silas worked quickly, removing the saddle and pack, rubbing the animal down with straw. Ayani stood by the stable door, watching him work. In the dim light filtering through the gaps in the boards, her face was unreadable. "Go on inside," Silas said. "I'll get a fire started in a minute." She studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked to the cabin. Silas finished with the mule, making sure it had water and feed, then followed. The cabin's main room was ice cold, their breath visible in the air. Ayani stood in the center, taking in the sparse furnishings. A rough table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, shelves lined with traps and tools. Mary's rocking chair still sat by the cold fireplace, a quilt draped over its back. Silas busied himself with the fire, grateful for something to do with his hands. The kindling caught quickly, and soon warmth began to creep into the room. He added larger logs, then stood, brushing bark from his hands. "You hungry?" he asked. Ayani hadn't moved from her spot. In the firelight, he could see her more clearly, the high cheekbones, the firm set of her jaw, the wariness that seemed etched into every line of her body. "I've got venison," he continued, filling the silence. "Some cornmeal, too. Coffee, if you drink it." "Still nothing?" Silas turned to the shelves, pulling down his meager supplies. His hands moved automatically, slicing meat, mixing cornmeal with water for Johnny cakes, setting the coffee pot on the fire. All the while, he felt her eyes on him, watchful and measuring. When the food was ready, he set 2 plates on the table. "Eat," he said, sitting down at one place. Ayani moved then, slowly, like a wild animal approaching a trap. She sat across from him but didn't touch the food. "It's not poisoned," Silas said, taking a bite of his own Johnny cake to demonstrate. She picked up a piece of venison, chewed slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. They ate in silence, the storm howling around the cabin like all the demons of hell. When she'd finished, she set her plate down carefully and spoke for the second time since he'd met her. "Why?" One word, but it held multitudes. Silas understood. Why had he traded for her? Why had he brought her here? What did he expect? He looked into his coffee cup, searching for words. "I don't rightly know," he said finally. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be alone. Maybe because—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't know." Ayani rose from the table, moving to stand before the fire. The buffalo robe had slipped from her shoulders, and he could see the tension in her spine, the way she held herself ready to fight or flee. "I won't touch you," Silas said quietly. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." She turned then, studying him with those dark, fathomless eyes. Whatever she saw there, it seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once, then moved to the bed, still wearing the buffalo robe. Silas cleaned the plates, banked the fire, laid out his bedroll on the floor. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, there was only the pop of settling logs and the sound of 2 people breathing in the darkness as he lay there, staring at the ceiling. Silas wondered again what he'd done. Come morning, he'd be trapped here with a woman who had every reason to hate him, while winter closed its fist around the mountains. But tonight, at least, she was warm, fed, safe. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the corner, Ayani shifted slightly on the narrow bed. Silas closed his eyes and tried not to think about how long it had been since another person had shared this space, how the cabin already felt less empty despite the ocean of silence between them. The storm would blow itself out by morning. What came after? That was tomorrow's worry. For now, there was only the fire's warmth, the wind's howl, and 2 damaged souls sharing shelter against the cold. The first 3 days passed in near complete silence. Ayani refused all food, sitting motionless by the window like a statue carved from dark wood. She drank water when Silas left it within reach, but nothing more. Her eyes followed the swirling snow outside, and sometimes Silas wondered if she was calculating her chances of survival if she ran. He went about his routine, checking his trap lines near the cabin, splitting firewood, melting snow for water, but found himself setting aside portions of every meal. Salt pork and beans, cornbread with the last of his honey, venison stew that filled the cabin with its rich aroma. Each plate sat untouched until he finally cleared it away. "You'll die if you don't eat," he said on the 4th morning, frustration bleeding into his voice. She turned those dark eyes on him, and for a moment he thought she might speak. Instead, she returned her gaze to the window. The message was clear. Perhaps death was preferable. That night, Silas lay on his bedroll staring at the rafters, unable to sleep. The silence pressed down like a physical weight, broken only by the settling of logs in the fire. It reminded him too much of other silences, the terrible quiet in this same room 3 winters past, when Mary's labored breathing had finally stilled. He'd met Mary in Independence, Missouri, where she'd been working in her father's dry goods store, Sweet-voiced Mary with cornflower eyes and hands that always smelled of lavender soap. She'd followed him to these mountains without complaint, learned to skin game and tend a garden in soil more rock than earth. When the fever took her, he'd sat by this same fire for days, her body laid out on the table because the ground was too frozen to dig. A soft movement pulled him from his memories. Ayani had risen from the bed, moving toward the door with ghost-like silence. Silas remained still, watching through slitted eyes as she lifted the bar and stepped out into the night. He counted to 10 before following, grabbing his rifle from its pegs. The snow had stopped, leaving the world crystalline under a crescent moon. Her tracks led toward the stable, and for a moment Silas thought she meant to take the mule, but she passed it by. Continuing into the trees, he found her 20 yards from the cabin, kneeling in a small clearing. Her hands moved in precise gestures, and though he couldn't understand the words she whispered, he recognized the cadence of prayer. In the moonlight, tears tracked silver down her cheeks. Silas withdrew silently, returning to the cabin. When she came back an hour later, her face composed once more. He pretended to be asleep, but he'd left a plate by the fire, cornbread and dried apples. In the morning, it was gone. The next day brought the first break in the weather. Weak sunlight filtered through the windows, and Silas decided to check his furthest trap line. He'd been avoiding it since bringing Ayani home, unwilling to leave her alone for the half-day journey. "I'll be back before dark," he told her, shouldering his rifle. "There's food in the pot. Water's fresh." She sat by the window as always, but something in her posture had changed, less rigid, perhaps, or maybe he was imagining it. The trek through the snow was brutal, but the trap line yielded 2 foxes and a beaver. Silas reset the traps, his mind wandering as his hands worked automatically. What was he doing? What had he hoped to accomplish? The woman clearly wanted nothing from him but to be left alone. He was skinning the beaver when the wolves appeared. 3 of them, lean and hungry, drawn by the scent of blood. Silas reached for his rifle, but his movement spooked them into action. The largest lunged, catching his shoulder as he twisted away. Pain flared hot and sharp as teeth tore through his coat. He got the rifle up, firing one-handed. The wolf yelped and fell back. The others circled, wary now. Silas chambered another round, his shoulder screaming. Blood soaked through his coat, dripping onto the snow. The second shot sent them running. Silas leaned against a tree, breathing hard. The journey back would be agony, but staying here meant freezing or bleeding to death. He fashioned a rough bandage from his shirt, gathered his traps and pelts, and began the long walk home. Darkness was falling when he stumbled through the cabin door. Ayani looked up from her place by the window, and her eyes widened at the blood. "It's nothing," Silas said, but his legs betrayed him. He sank into a chair, the room spinning. "Just need to rest a minute." She was beside him before he realized she'd moved. Efficient hands peeled away his coat, revealing the torn flesh beneath. She said something sharp in Apache, a curse. He thought, then moved to the shelves. "Really, I can—" he started, but she silenced him with a look. She worked with practiced skill, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made him hiss through clenched teeth. Her fingers were gentle despite their efficiency, spreading a poultice of herbs he didn't recognize before binding the shoulder tightly with strips torn from a clean shirt. When she finished, she stepped back, studying her work. Silas flexed his shoulder experimentally. The pain was still there, but muted, manageable. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once, then surprised him by speaking. "No die." Her English was accented but clear. "Wound is clean, no die." It was the most she'd said since arriving. Silas felt something ease in his chest. "I'm obliged," he said. "Where did you learn—" But she'd already turned away, returning to her window. Still, she'd saved his bacon, and that was something. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm. Silas's shoulder kept him close to the cabin, and Ayani began to venture further from her window perch. She tended his wound each morning, changing the poultice with the same quiet efficiency. Sometimes he caught her watching him as he worked at small tasks, repairing a trap, sharpening knives, patching holes in his spare shirts. One morning, he woke to find her at the fireplace, stirring something in the pot. The smell made his mouth water, wild onions and herbs mixed with the venison he'd left to soak. "Smells good," he offered. She glanced at him, then ladled stew into 2 bowls. They ate together for the first time since that first night, still in silence, but somehow more comfortable. That afternoon, a blizzard struck with renewed fury. The wind howled like a living thing, driving snow through every tiny gap in the walls. Silas stuffed rags into the cracks, but the temperature plummeted. Ice formed on the inside of the windows. By nightfall, even with the fire roaring, the cold was bone deep. Silas added every log he dared, but it wasn't enough. He could see Ayani shivering beneath a thin blanket on the bed. "We need to share warmth," he said finally, "or we'll both freeze." She looked at him for a long moment, then shifted to make room on the narrow bed. Silas lay down beside her, careful to keep space between them. But as the night deepened and the cold intensified, they moved closer by degrees until they lay back to back, sharing heat through layers of clothing, somewhere in the depths of night. Silas dreamed. Mary was there, standing by the fire, but her face kept shifting, becoming someone else. He reached for her, calling her name. A hand touched his face, gentle but calloused. Not Mary's hand. He opened his eyes to find Ayani looking down at him, her expression unreadable in the dim firelight. "Dream," she said quietly. "Bad dream." Silas realized he'd been speaking aloud, maybe crying out. Embarrassment heated his face. "Sorry, I didn't mean to." "She was wife?" Ayani asked. "Mary?" He nodded, throat tight. "Died 3 winters back. Fever took her." Ayani was quiet for a moment. Then, "My husband, 1 winter passed. Soldiers took him." The confession hung between them in the darkness. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, there was a different kind of intensity. 2 people who understood loss, lying inches apart in a narrow bed. Neither spoke again. Ayani turned away, presenting her back once more. But when Silas settled behind her, she didn't pull away. They slept like that, 2 bodies curved together against the cold, while the blizzard tried to tear the world apart outside. In the morning, they rose and went about their tasks as if nothing had changed. But something had shifted in the silence between them. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but of people who had glimpsed each other's wounds. Silas watched Ayani move about the cabin, stoking the fire, melting snow for water, and realized with a start that the place no longer felt empty. Her presence had changed the very air, made the shadows less oppressive. When she brought him the poultice for his shoulder, her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary. When he showed her how to set a small trap for rabbits, she stood close enough that he could smell the sage in her hair. That evening, as they shared another meal of stew, Silas found himself talking. Nothing important, just stories of the mountains, the best places to find elk, the time a bear had chased him up a tree. Ayani listened, occasionally asking a question in her careful English. When full dark came and the cold crept in again, they moved to the bed without discussion. This time, Ayani turned to face him, though she kept her eyes closed. In the firelight, he could see the delicate lines of her face, the way her lips parted slightly in sleep. Silas closed his own eyes, but sleep was long in coming. He was too aware of her warmth, the sound of her breathing, the way she shifted slightly closer as the night deepened. It had been so long since he'd shared a bed with anyone. He'd forgotten how it felt to not be alone. The storm would pass, the snow would melt, spring would come, and with it, decisions would need to be made. But for now, in the depths of winter, they had found something neither had expected. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. A tiny flame in the darkness, as fragile and necessary as the fire that kept them alive. The worst of the winter storms had passed, leaving the mountains wrapped in a crystalline silence. Inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled, comfortable now, broken by small domestic sounds and occasional words. Ayani had claimed a corner of the main room for her few possessions. The torn doeskin dress she'd arrived in, now mended with the neat stitches, a small beaded pouch she kept always near, and a collection of roots and herbs she'd gathered from the forest floor where snow had melted. Silas found himself watching her more often than he cared to admit, the way she moved with economical grace, never wasting emotion, how her fingers worked when she wove strips of rabbit fur into warm mittens, the rare moments when something, a particularly fat grouse he'd brought home, or the antics of a pine marten outside the window, would draw an almost smile to her lips. The changed sleeping arrangement had become routine. Each night they lay together for warmth, careful not to touch more than necessary, but aware of every breath, every shift of weight. It was torture and comfort combined, a daily reminder that he was no longer alone. One afternoon, while checking traps near the creek, Silas spotted fresh elk tracks. His shoulder had healed well under Ayani's care, and they needed the meat. He returned to the cabin to find her grinding dried berries with a stone. "Big elk down by Willow Creek," he said, reaching for his rifle. "Might be gone 2 days tracking it." She looked up, and something flickered in her eyes. Concern? He'd been reading her expressions better lately, learning the subtle shifts that served as her vocabulary. "I'll be fine," he added. "Done it 100 times before. I come," she said simply. Silas blinked. In all their weeks together, she'd never ventured far from the cabin. "It's rough country, cold camps." She rose, already reaching for the buffalo robe. "I know rough country." There was steel in her voice that brooked no argument. Silas found himself nodding. "All right then, we'll need to pack light." They left at dawn, moving through the forest like two shadows. Ayani kept pace easily, her steps nearly silent on the snow. When Silas paused to read sign, she would crouch beside him, studying the tracks with equal intensity. The elk led them high into the mountains, through stands of aspen and pine, across frozen streams that sang beneath their ice shells. As the day wore on, Silas became aware of a strange contentment. He'd hunted alone for so long, he'd forgotten the pleasure of shared purpose. They made camp in a sheltered grove as darkness fell. Silas built a small fire while Ayani gathered pine boughs for bedding. They ate dried meat and berries in companionable silence, the fire painting moving shadows on the trees. "Your husband," Silas said suddenly, surprising himself. Was he a hunter? Ayani's hand stilled on the stick she'd been whittling. For a long moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. "Yes," she said finally. "Best tracker in our band. Taught me." She paused, then added quietly, "His name was Samuel. Sam." The English name surprised Silas. Samuel. Mission name. The fathers gave it when he was boy. Her voice carried an edge of old bitterness. "Said his real name was Heathen?" They lapsed into silence again, but it was weighted now with unspoken questions. "Finally," Ayani asked. "You're Mary. She was good woman?" "The best," Silas said without hesitation. "Too good for these mountains. Too good for me." He poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward. "I should have taken her back east when she got sick. Might have found a doctor who could help." "Maybe, maybe not." Ayani's voice was gentle. "Mountains not kill her. Sickness kill her." It was the most she'd ever spoken at once, and the simple absolution in her words made his throat tight. They sat quietly after that, watching the fire die to embers. When the cold drove them to their makeshift bed of pine boughs, they lay closer than ever before, conserving heat under shared blankets. Silas was nearly asleep when he felt Ayani shiver, not from cold, but from some inner chill. Without thinking, he shifted closer, wrapping an arm around her. She stiffened for a moment, then relaxed against him with a soft sigh. They lay like that, her back pressed to his chest, his arm protective around her waist. And for the first time in years, Silas felt something inside him begin to thaw. They found the elk the next morning, a magnificent bull grazing in a meadow dusted with new snow. Silas raised his rifle, but Ayani touched his arm. She pointed to a stand of trees upwind, motioning for him to circle around. Working together, they maneuvered into position. The shot, when it came, was clean. The elk dropped where it stood. As Silas approached the fallen animal, Ayani began to sing, a low, melodic chant in Apache. A death song, he realized, honoring the animal's sacrifice. The work of butchering took hours. They packed what they could carry, cached the rest high in a tree to retrieve later. As they prepared to leave, Ayani did something unexpected. She took a small portion of the meat and buried it in the snow, whispering words Silas couldn't understand. "For the mountain spirits," she explained, seeing his curious look. "So they know we take only what we need." The journey back was slower, burdened with meat, but Silas found himself in no hurry. When they stopped to rest, Ayani would point out things he'd never noticed, the way certain birds called to warn of weather changes, which lichens could be boiled for medicine, how to read the health of the forest in the spacing of trees. "Sam taught you all this?" She nodded. "And my grandmother, before the soldiers came." That night, camped once more under the stars, she told him fragments of her story, how her band had lived in these mountains for generations, the arrival of settlers and soldiers, the increasing conflicts over land and water, the raid on Mercy's Bend that had been retaliation for stolen horses, and the bloody reprisal that followed. "Sam went to talk peace," she said, staring into the fire. "Took 2 others. They say he attacked the soldiers, but Sam never attacked when talking peace. Never." Silas felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew the incident she spoke of. Everyone in the territory did. 3 Apache men killed trying to ambush an army patrol. Or so the story went. But looking at Ayani's face, seeing the raw grief there, he wondered what the truth really was. They reached the cabin late the next afternoon, tired but successful. As they unpacked the elk meat, working side by side to cut and store it, Silas was struck by how natural it felt, like they'd been doing this together for years instead of weeks. That evening, Ayani made a stew with fresh elk meat and some of her gathered herbs. The smell filled the cabin with warmth and promise. As they ate, Silas found himself talking about things he hadn't shared with anyone. His childhood in Tennessee, why he'd come west, the dream he and Mary had shared of building a real homestead. "Why stay after?" Ayani asked. "Why not go back?" Silas considered. "Nothing to go back to, I suppose. And these mountains, they get in your blood, even with all the sorrow. I can't imagine living anywhere else." She nodded slowly. "I understand. My people, some went to reservation, but mountains are home, even alone. Better to die where ancestors walked." "You're not alone now," Silas said quietly. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of what was growing, unnamed but undeniable. That night, when they settled into bed, Ayani turned to face him instead of presenting her back. In the dim light, her eyes were deep pools of shadow. "Silas," she said, and his name on her lips sounded like a question. He reached out, carefully, and brushed that persistent strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered against her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin. She closed her eyes, leaning ever so slightly into his touch. "I'm glad you're here," he whispered. "Even though you traded whole winter's furs?" There was the faintest hint of teasing in her voice, and it made him smile. "Best trade I ever made." She opened her eyes then, and what he saw there made his breath catch, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He leaned closer. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered. When they pulled apart, Ayani tucked her head beneath his chin, fitting against him like she belonged there. Silas held her close, marveling at the feeling of her heart beating against his chest. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, and the wind whispered through the pines. But inside the cabin, 2 wounded souls had found something worth more than all the furs in the mountains. A second chance at love, as unexpected and precious as spring water in the desert. They didn't speak of it. Not yet. Words would come later. For now, there was the warmth of shared space, the comfort of another heartbeat in the darkness, and the promise that tomorrow, neither would wake alone. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the corner, Mary's rocking chair sat empty, but it no longer seemed like a monument to loss. Instead, it was simply a chair, waiting to be useful again, like everything else in this cabin that was slowly coming back to life. The morning ritual had become sacred to Ayani. Each dawn, before Silas stirred, she would slip from their shared warmth and make her way to a small clearing east of the cabin. There, as the first light painted the peaks rose and gold, she would kneel in the snow and speak to the spirits of her ancestors, to Sam's wandering soul. Silas had discovered her practice weeks ago, but never intruded. He understood the need for private grief, having spent his own hours talking to Mary's memory. But this morning was different. Following at a distance, he noticed new items in her ritual: sage bundles, a small fire, and something that made his blood run cold. A beaded necklace he recognized from the stories that had circulated after the Mercy's Bend incident. The necklace had belonged to one of the dead Apache men. The soldiers had displayed such items as proof of their victory. If Ayani had it, then Sam. She must have sensed his presence because she turned, her face streaked with tears but composed. In her hands, she clutched the necklace like a lifeline. "This was his," she said simply. "I took from his body before soldiers." She swallowed hard. "Before they took trophies." Silas felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders like stones. He knew he should speak, should tell her about his own past, but the words lodged in his throat like shards of glass. That day passed in strained quiet. Silas threw himself into work, repairing the roof, checking trap lines, anything to avoid the conversation that loomed between them. But that evening, as they sat by the fire, Ayani's steady gaze finally undid him. "I was there," he said, the words falling like hammers. "At Mercy's Bend. Not the raid, but after, when the militia rode out for payback." Ayani went very still, her hands frozen on the shirt she'd been mending. "I didn't want to go," Silas continued, staring into the flames. "But I had a contract to supply meat to the army post. They said any white man who didn't ride with them was an Indian lover. A traitor. Said they'd burn me out." He laughed bitterly. "Should have let him." "Tell me." Ayani's voice was barely a whisper. "All of it." So he did. The chaos of that day. The bloodlust that had infected the mob. How they'd found 3 Apache men coming down from the mountains, supposedly to negotiate. How quickly talking had turned to shooting. How he'd fired his rifle into the air, trying to scatter the horses, to create confusion enough for escape. But it hadn't been enough. One of them, tall man with a scar here. Silas touched his chin. He fought fierce. Took 4 men with him before. He couldn't finish. "Sam," Ayani breathed. "The scar from breaking horse when he was young." They sat in terrible silence, the truth hanging between them like a blade. Then Ayani rose abruptly and walked out into the night. Silas didn't follow. He sat by the dying fire, wondering if she would return, knowing he wouldn't blame her if she didn't. Hours passed. The fire died to embers. Just as Silas was about to bed down on the floor, accepting that he'd lost her, the door opened. Ayani stood there, snow in her hair, her face unreadable. "You tried to help," she said. "Not enough. Not nearly enough." She moved into the room, standing before him. "You think I blame you? Don't you? You should. I blame men who killed him. I blame hate that made them animals. I blame world that says Apache life worth less than white man's horse." Her voice broke slightly. "But not you. Never you. How can you even look at me?" She knelt beside his chair, taking his face in her cold hands. "Because I see you. Silas Granger. See man who traded winter's work for woman he didn't know. Man who shares his food, his warmth, his sorrow. Man who carries guilt for others' sins. I was there," he repeated helplessly. "Yes, and now you're here. With me. She studied his face intently. Sam is dead. I am alive. You are alive. We choose what to do with that. The forgiveness in her words broke something inside him. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time since Mary's death, truly wept. Ayani held him through it, her own tears silent on his neck. When the storm passed, they were both exhausted, moving as one. They made their way to bed, holding each other with desperate tenderness. No passion yet, just the need to affirm life in the face of so much death. He didn't die because of you, Ayani whispered in the darkness. He died because men's hearts were poisoned. You tried to save him. That matters. Sleep came slowly, fitfully. Silas dreamed of gunshots and screaming horses, of Sam's scarred face and Ayani's tears. He woke to find her watching him, one hand gentle on his chest. Bad dream? He nodded, not trusting his voice. Tell me good memory. She said, something bright. So he told her about the day he'd first seen these mountains, how they'd risen from the plains like promises, about finding this valley, building the cabin log by log with Mary singing beside him. Small things, good things, until the shadows receded. In return, she shared her own memories. Sam teaching her to read stars, her grandmother's laughter, the taste of piñon nuts roasted over autumn fires, stories that painted a picture of a life before loss, before soldiers and settlements changed everything. As dawn approached, they made love for the first time. It was tentative, careful, as if they might shatter with too much force. But in that joining was a kind of healing, an affirmation that life persists despite all efforts to destroy it. After, they lay entwined, watching light creep across the ceiling. What happens now? Silas asked. Now we live, Ayani said simply. We hunt, we eat, we keep warm. We remember the dead but don't die with them. Over the following days, something fundamental shifted between them. The secret was out, the worst known and survived. In its place grew something stronger than passion, a partnership forged in truth. Ayani began teaching Silas her language, laughing gently at his clumsy pronunciation. He showed her how to read the English books Mary had treasured, their heads bent together over pages in the lamplight. They hunted together, worked together, built a life together, but the shadow of the past wasn't finished with them. One afternoon, while Ayani was gathering herbs, Silas heard horses approaching. He grabbed his rifle, stepping onto the porch to see 3 riders from Mercy's Bend. Granger, the lead man called. Heard you got yourself a squaw. State your business, Morrison, then get off my land. Morrison spat tobacco juice into the snow. Just being neighborly. Wanted to make sure you knew what you were harboring. That woman belonged to one of them bucks we put down last year. Might be she's got revenge on her mind. The only revenge I see is you trying to stir trouble where there ain't none. Man takes up with a savage, makes folks wonder which side he's on. Silas jacked around into his rifle's chamber, the sound sharp in the cold air. I'm on the side of being left in peace. Now ride on before I forget my manners. The men exchanged looks, but turned their horses. As they left, Morrison called back. This ain't over. Granger, town's got a long memory. When Ayani returned, Silas told her about the visit. She listened quietly, then said, They will come back. Let them. This is our home. She touched his face gently. I won't be reason for more death. You're not the reason. Hate is the reason. He caught her hand, holding it tight. I failed Sam. I won't fail you. That night, as storm clouds gathered, they made preparations, cleaned weapons, secured shutters, laid in extra water. If trouble was coming, they'd meet it together. Lying in bed, listening to wind build outside, Ayani said, I need you to know, if something happens, these months with you, nothing's going to happen. Silas interrupted. Listen. She pressed fingers to his lips. These months gave me back my life. After Sam, I was walking ghost. You brought me back. Whatever comes, I'm grateful. He kissed her fingers, then her lips, then pulled her close. We're going to grow old in this cabin. Prove them all wrong. You'll see. And she didn't answer, just held him tighter as the storm broke overhead. In the morning, they would face whatever came. But tonight, in their bed beneath the rafters, they had each other. Love salvaged from loss, hope kindled from ashes. The fire burned low, casting familiar shadows. Outside, snow began to fall, covering tracks and trails, making the world clean and new. Inside, two hearts beat in rhythm, no longer alone, no longer afraid. Whatever the dawn brought, they would meet it as one. Spring came slowly to the mountains, melting snow revealing the earth in patches like a quilt coming undone. The cabin that had been their shelter through the harsh winter now felt different, warmer somehow, filled with small touches that spoke of shared life. Ayani had woven baskets that hung from the rafters, storing herbs and roots. New pelts decorated the walls, taken from successful hunts they'd made together. Mary's rocking chair no longer sat empty. Ayani used it in the evenings while mending clothes or working beadwork by firelight. They had fallen into the rhythm of partnership, their days flowing together like confluence of two streams. Mornings saw them working side by side, Silas splitting wood while Ayani tended the garden plot she'd cleared beside the cabin. She'd insisted on planting the three sisters as her grandmother had taught, corn, beans, and squash growing together in harmony. "See how they help each other?" she explained one morning, kneeling in the dark soil. "Corn gives beans something to climb. Beans make soil rich. Squash leaves keep ground moist, keep weeds away." She looked up at him with that rare smile that still made his chest tight. Better together than alone. The words hung between them, meaning more than vegetables. Their evenings had become Silas's favorite time. After supper, Ayani would work on a blanket she was weaving, a complex pattern of mountains and sky that grew beneath her skilled fingers. He would read aloud from Mary's books, stumbling sometimes over the words, but persisting because Ayani loved the stories. Her English had improved remarkably. She often corrected his pronunciation now with gentle teasing. But it was the nights that had transformed most completely. What had begun as necessity, sharing warmth to survive, had become something deeper. They came together with a hunger that surprised them both, as if trying to make up for all the lonely years in a single season. Sometimes tender, sometimes fierce, always with an underlying urgency, as if they knew their happiness was borrowed time. One such night, as they lay breathless and intertwined. Ayani traced the scar on Silas's shoulder where the wolf had caught him. "I thought you would die that day," she said quietly. "Before I knew you, I thought, another white man's blood on the snow. Good, but then I saw your face, saw pain there, and I couldn't let you die." "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. "After everything, why save me?" She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. "My grandmother said hate is like drinking poison, hoping enemy dies. When soldiers killed Sam, hate filled me up, ate at me like sickness. But when I saw you bleeding..." She pressed her palm flat against his chest. "I remembered I was healer before I was widow." Silas caught her hand, brought it to his lips. "Thank God for your grandmother's wisdom. She would have liked you." Ayani said, "Man who trades winter's furs for woman he doesn't know." She would say that's man with good spirit, maybe touched in head, but good spirit. He laughed, pulling her closer. These moments of lightness were precious, all the more so for their rarity. The trouble, when it came, arrived on a perfect spring morning. Silas was checking trap lines along the creek when he heard the horses. Many horses, moving fast. He ran back toward the cabin, fear clawing at his throat, but he was too far away. The terrain too rough. By the time he reached the clearing, gasping for breath, he saw them. 8 men from Mercy's Bend, some he recognized, others strangers. They had Ayani on her knees in front of the cabin, hands bound behind her back. Morrison stood over her with a rope. "Let her go!" Silas roared. Raising his rifle, several guns swung his way. Morrison smiled coldly. "Now, Granger, no need for anybody else to die today. We're just enforcing territorial law. This here Apache was involved in the murder of white settlers. We got testimony. That's a lie, and you know it. Jake Thornton says different. Says she confessed to him about planning revenge for her dead buck. Says she was working with you to ambush innocent folks. Thornton's a drunk and a liar. Maybe so, but he's a white man testifying against an Indian. That's all the law requires. Silas kept his rifle up, calculating odds, 8 against 1, and Ayani in the middle. You touch her, I'll kill you all. You'll try. Morrison's voice was almost sympathetic. Look, Granger, we ain't unreasonable men. You've been hexed by this savage. We understand. Walk away now. Let us handle this, and you can go back to being a white man in good standing. Go to hell, Morrison sighed. Have it your way. He nodded to his men. What happened next would replay in Silas's nightmares for years. He shot Morrison first, the man crumpling with a look of surprise. Then chaos, gunfire from all directions, men shouting, horses screaming. Silas dove behind a woodpile as bullets chewed splinters around him. Through the melee, he saw Ayani, still on her knees but not passive. She'd gotten her hands free somehow and had pulled a knife from her boot. As one man reached for her, she struck, swift as a snake. He went down, clutching his thigh. The cabin, Silas yelled. She rolled aside as another man fired, came up running. Silas laid down covering fire, forcing the attackers to scatter. For a moment, it seemed they might make it. Then Ayani stumbled. Bright blood bloomed across her side. She kept moving, teeth gritted, but slower now. Silas broke cover, racing to her, shooting wild to keep heads down. He got an arm around her, half carrying her toward the door. 5 feet, 3. Then fire punched through his own back, spinning him around. He fell hard, Ayani tumbling beside him. No, she crawled to him, pressing hands against the wound in his chest where the bullet had exited. No, no, no! The remaining men approached cautiously, 5 still standing, including one clutching a wounded arm. They formed a loose circle, guns trained on the bleeding couple. Well, one said, now what? Morrison's dead. So finish it, another replied. Like we planned. I didn't plan on Morrison dying, or shooting Granger. This complicates things. As they argued, Ayani pulled Silas against her, cradling his head in her lap. Blood soaked the ground beneath them. His, hers, mixing in the dirt. Run, he whispered. While they're talking, run! No! She bent over him, hair falling like a curtain. Not without you. Stubborn woman. Stubborn man. Tears tracked through the dirt on her face. Should have left when Morrison warned us. No, this is our home. Worth fighting for. He coughed, tasting copper. You're worth fighting for. The men had reached a decision. They approached slowly, the one in front saying, Step away from him. Woman. We'll make it quick. Ayani raised her head, and Silas saw the old fire in her eyes. You want me? Come take me. She still had the knife, he realized, held low, hidden by their bodies, even wounded, even dying. She would fight. Together, he whispered. Together. She agreed. The man stepped closer, raising his pistol. Your choice. That's when they heard it. Horses, many horses, riding hard. The attackers turned, confused, as a dozen riders burst into the clearing. Not more mob, but soldiers. Actual Yupis army, led by a grizzled sergeant Silas recognized from the fort. Stand down, the sergeant bellowed. All of you, weapons on the ground, now! Confusion reigned. Men shouted, gestured, but faced with armed cavalry, they complied. The sergeant dismounted, surveying the carnage with disgust. Got a wire from the territorial governor. He announced, Seems someone sent a letter about false testimony and murder charges. We're here to investigate. His eyes found Morrison's body. Looks like we're too late for some. Silas felt the world graying at the edges. Ayani's face above him was fading, though he could still feel her hands pressed against his chest. Stay with me, she pleaded. Stay. He wanted to, God, how he wanted to, but the darkness was rising, and he was so tired. The last thing he heard was Ayani's voice, not speaking English or Apache, but something older, a song without words, a keening that followed him down into the black. Later, They told him he'd died twice on the way to the fort's surgeon. Told him Ayani had refused to leave his side, had threatened to gut anyone who tried to separate them. Told him she'd kept pressure on his wounds for the entire agonizing journey, her own injury bleeding through makeshift bandages. But in that darkness between living and dying, Silas knew none of that. He only knew the weight of her hands on his chest, the sound of her voice calling him back, and the absolute certainty that if he let go, he would break something in her that could never be mended. So he held on. Through surgery, through fever, through nights when breathing felt like drowning. He held on because somewhere in the darkness, Ayani was holding on too, and he'd be damned if he'd leave her to face this world alone. Spring was giving way to summer when he finally opened his eyes to find her there, thin and worn, but alive. 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 She was asleep in a chair beside his bed, one hand resting on his arm as if to assure herself he was real. He turned his hand palm up, weakly catching her fingers. She woke instantly, eyes flooding with tears she'd probably held back for weeks. "Stubborn man," she whispered. "Stubborn woman," he replied. And then she was kissing him, careful of his wounds but desperate with relief. And he knew that whatever came next, testimony, trials, the judgment of the world, they would face it as they'd faced everything else. Together. The letter arrived on a humid July morning, delivered by an army courier who looked uncomfortable in his wool uniform. Silas was sitting on the porch, still moving carefully as his wounds healed, while Ayani worked in the garden. She'd expanded it considerably during his recovery, and now corn stalks reached toward the sky alongside beans and squash. "Silas Granger?" the courier asked. "That's me. From the territorial attorney in Prescott, sir." He handed over the sealed envelope, saluted awkwardly, and rode off. Ayani came to the porch, dirt on her hands, concern in her eyes. They'd been waiting for word about the legal proceedings since spring. 3 of the surviving attackers had been arrested, but what would come of it remained uncertain. Silas broke the seal with unsteady fingers. As he read, his expression darkened. "What does it say?" He handed her the letter. Her English reading was still developing, but she'd improved remarkably. He watched her lips move silently as she worked through the formal language. "They want me to testify," she said finally, "in Prescott, about Sam's death, and about Morrison's attack on us." She set the letter down carefully. "They will listen to Apache woman. The lawyer seems to think so, says there's new evidence. Other witnesses have come forward." He caught her hand. "You don't have to do this. We could leave, go further west, California, maybe, start over where nobody knows us." Ayani was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the valley they'd fought to keep. "All my life, I run. When soldiers came to our lands, we ran. When they killed Sam, I ran. Even coming here with you, another kind of running." She turned to him. "Maybe time to stop running." The journey to Prescott took 5 days. They traveled with an army escort, partly for protection, partly to ensure they appeared. The soldiers treated them with wary respect, especially after their sergeant warned them about the Apache woman who killed 2 men with a knife while gut-shot. Prescott was larger than Silas remembered, bustling with miners and merchants. People stared as they rode in, a mountain man and an Apache woman, clearly together. Some looks were curious, others hostile, but Ayani kept her head high, meeting every gaze with steady defiance. The lawyer, a thin man named Cornelius Webb, met them at a boarding house he'd arranged. "Mrs. Ayani," he said, surprising them both with the courtesy. "Mr. Granger, thank you for coming. I know this can't be easy." "What's this new evidence?" Silas asked. Webb adjusted his spectacles. "It seems Morrison and his friends left quite a paper trail. Letters discussing their plans to clear out the savages and their white sympathizers. One particularly damning note from Morrison to Thornton promising payment for false testimony." He paused. "And we have a witness who saw Sam and the others trying to surrender before they were shot." "Who?" Ayani asked sharply. "A freight driver named Josiah Mills. He was hidden in the rocks, scared to come forward before. But Morrison's dead, and conscience finally got the better of him. Over the next days, Webb prepared them for the hearing. He was thorough but gentle with Ayani, understanding the courage it took for her to relive Sam's death. She told her story clearly, the soldiers arriving at their camp, Sam going out to talk, the sudden gunfire, being forced to watch as they mutilated the bodies. "They made us watch," she said, her voice steady despite tears tracking down her cheeks. Said this is what happens to Apache who forget their place. Then they took trophies, Sam's necklace, his medicine bundle, laughed while doing it. Webb took notes, his expression grim. The defense will try to paint you as unreliable, vengeful. They'll bring up the raid on Mercy's Bend, suggest Sam was part of it. He wasn't. He spoke against it, said violence only brings more violence. I believe you, but we need to make them believe. The day of the hearing dawned gray and oppressive. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tobacco smoke and hostility. Silas sat in the gallery, fists clenched as Ayani took the witness chair. She wore her best dress, one they'd bought in town, but had insisted on wearing Sam's necklace openly. The prosecutor, a florid man named Harrison, began gently enough. Ayani recounted finding Sam's body, identifying the men responsible, several of whom sat in the defendant's box looking sullen. Then came the defense attorney, a sharp-faced man who reminded Silas of a buzzard. Mrs. Ayani, or should I say, widow of a known hostel. Tell me, what was your husband doing so close to Mercy's Bend if not planning mischief? Trading, Ayani replied calmly. He had pelts to trade. Ah, yes, trading. And these pelts, where are they? Did anyone see them? Taken, like everything else. How convenient. And you expect us to believe that 3 Apache warriors approached an army patrol with peaceful intent? Yes, even though your people had just raided Mercy's Bend. Not our people. Different band. Sam spoke against the raid. The lawyer smiled coldly. So you say. Tell me, what did you do after your husband's death? Survived. By selling yourself to white men? The courtroom erupted. Silas started to rise, but Webb held him back. Ayani, however, remained composed. I was sold, she said clearly. Like horse or dog. Sold by men who think Apache woman is thing, not person. Mr. Granger bought my freedom. Bought you? You mean? No. Bought my freedom. Gave me choice. I chose to stay. And in return, you convinced him to help you get revenge. No revenge, justice, different things. The questioning continued for hours. The defense attorney tried every angle, suggesting she'd seduced Silas, that they'd planned to ambush Morrison, that her testimony was coached. Through it all, Ayani remained calm, answering each question with simple truth. Finally, Josiah Mills took the stand. The freight driver was nervous, sweating profusely, but his testimony was damning. He described in detail how Sam and the others had approached with hands raised, speaking English, trying to explain they were peaceful, how the soldiers had opened fire without warning, how Morrison had been there, laughing as he took trophies from the bodies. Why didn't you come forward before? The prosecutor asked. Scared, Mills admitted. Morrison had friends, lots of them, but when I heard he was dead, and that Apache woman near died trying to get justice, he shrugged. Figured maybe it was time someone told the truth. The defendant's own letters were entered into evidence. The plan laid out in Morrison's own hand: provoke incidents, blame the Apache, clear the land for settlement. Thornton, now sober and facing prison, broke down and confessed to lying about Ayani's confession. When closing arguments ended, the judge, a stern man with silver whiskers, retired to consider. The wait was agony. Silas and Ayani sat together on a bench outside, her hand in his, neither speaking. An hour passed, 2, then the bailiff called them back. In the matter of the murder of Samuel Crowfeather and 2 other Apache men, the judge intoned, I find sufficient evidence of criminal conspiracy. The defendants are bound over for trial in federal court. The courtroom exploded again, shouts of outrage from some, grim satisfaction from others. But the judge wasn't finished. As for the attack on Mr. Granger and Mrs. Ayani, while Mr. Morrison cannot stand trial, being deceased, the surviving participants are likewise bound over. This court recognizes the right of all persons, regardless of race, to defend themselves against unlawful attack. Outside the courtroom, Webb shook their hands vigorously. It's not a conviction yet, but it's more than any Apache has gotten in this territory. You've made history today. Don't want to make history, Ayani said quietly. Just wanted truth spoken. That evening, in their boarding house room, she finally let the walls down. Sobbed in Silas's arms for Sam, for herself, for all the losses that could never be restored. He held her through it, understanding that testimony had been its own kind of battle. He can rest now, she whispered finally. Sam can rest. They started home the next morning. At the edge of town, a small crowd had gathered, some Apache who'd heard about the hearing, a few white supporters, even some soldiers who'd served with honorable men and knew the truth of what happened at places like Mercy's Bend. An old Apache woman approached Ayani, spoke rapidly in their language. Ayani's eyes widened, then filled with fresh tears. What did she say? Silas asked. She knew my grandmother, says she's proud, says I carry the people's strength well. She wiped her eyes, straightening. Says the path ahead is still hard, but at least now there's a path. As they rode toward the mountains, Silas reached over and took her hand. No more running, no more running, she agreed. Whatever comes, we face it. Together, together. Behind them, Prescott faded into dust and distance. Ahead, the mountains rose blue and endless, holding their valley, their cabin, their life together. It wasn't the ending. There would be more trials, more challenges, more people who couldn't accept what they were to each other. But for now, they rode toward home. Two people who'd found love in the ashes of loss, who'd stood up to hatred and lived to tell about it. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, revealing the trail ahead clear and bright in her saddlebag. Ayani carried a copy of the court documents, proof that an Apache woman's words had been heard, believed, acted upon. It wasn't everything, but it was something, a beginning. As they climbed into the cool shade of the pines, she began to hum, not a morning song this time, but something else, a song of journeys completed and journeys yet to come. Silas found himself humming along, the melody strange on his tongue but right somehow. The mountains received them like old friends, and if the wind through the pines sounded like whispered blessings, perhaps it was. They'd earned whatever peace they could find, paid for it in blood and courage and truth. The rest they'd face as they'd learned to face everything, together. The federal trial took place in September, when the aspens were turning gold across the mountains. Silas and Ayani made the journey to Prescott again, this time without military escort. The intervening months had been quiet ones at the cabin, healing, working, preparing for whatever came next. The garden had flourished under Ayani's care, and they'd laid in good supplies for winter. This time, they knew what to expect. The courtroom was even more crowded. With newspaper reporters from as far as San Francisco, the case had gained attention. An Apache woman's testimony sending white men to federal trial was unprecedented in the territory. Ayani testified again, her voice stronger now, her English more polished. When the defense tried their same tactics, she met them with quiet dignity. Yes, she was Apache. Yes, her husband had been killed. No, she sought justice, not revenge. The surprise came when additional witnesses appeared. 2 soldiers from the patrol that had killed Sam stepped forward, young men whose consciences had finally overcome their fear. They corroborated every detail, the Apache men approaching peacefully, the order to fire without warning, Morrison's presence and participation. "Why speak now?" the prosecutor asked one soldier. "Private Daniel Hayes." "Because it wasn't war," Hayes said, his voice shaking. "It was murder, and I've seen that woman's face in my dreams every night since. Her watching while they did those things. Can't live with it anymore." The jury, all white men, as law required, deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood slowly, as if the weight of decision pressed on him. Guilty. One word. But it echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Guilty of false testimony. Guilty of attempted murder in the attack on Silas and Ayani. Sentences were handed down, 5 to 20 years hard labor. Not enough for lives lost, but more than any Apache had ever seen from white man's justice. Outside the courthouse, Ayani stood very still, Sam's necklace gleaming in the afternoon sun. "It's done," Silas said softly. "Yes." She touched the necklace gently. "Now he can rest." They stayed one more night in Prescott, at the boarding house. A package waited, from attorney Webb. Inside were documents making Silas and Ayani legal partners in the land claim, along with a note, "For the future, may it be brighter than the past." The journey home took longer this time. They stopped at a trading post to buy winter supplies with money Webb had helped them recover from Morrison's estate. Partial compensation for the attack. The trader, who'd heard about the trial, treated them with surprised respect. "Things are changing," he said, "wrapping their purchases. Slow, maybe, but changing." 3 days from home, they encountered something that stopped them cold. A group of Apache, mostly women and children, walking along the trail. Refugees from the reservation, looking for family scattered by war and policy. An old woman approached Ayani, speaking rapidly in Apache. Ayani gasped, then embraced her, tears flowing. "My mother's sister," she explained to Silas, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought she was dead. She thought I was dead." The reunion was bittersweet. So many lost, families torn apart, but there was joy, too, in finding even this small connection to her past. The group shared their meager meal, and Ayani caught up on news of scattered relatives. Ceremonies still practiced in secret. Children born who would never know the free life their parents had lived. "Come with us," Ayani's aunt urged. "Your place is with your people." Ayani glanced at Silas, then shook her head. "My place is with him. We have a home. You could come there, rest, resupply." The older woman studied Silas carefully, then spoke at length with Ayani. "Finally." She nodded. "Perhaps the spirits mean for some of us to walk between worlds, to show it can be done." They parted the next morning, the refugees continuing west, but not before Ayani's aunt pressed a small bundle into her hands, sacred items saved through years of hardship. "For your children," she said, glancing meaningfully between Ayani and Silas. As they watched the group disappear into the distance, Silas asked, "Do you regret it, not going with them?" "No." Ayani's answer was immediate. "I honor my people, carry their ways, but my path is different now." She took his hand. "Our path." They reached the cabin as afternoon shadows lengthened. Everything was as they'd left it. The garden beginning to brown with autumn. The woodpile stacked high. The small improvements they'd made together creating a real homestead. That evening, as they sat before the fire, Ayani unwrapped her aunt's gift. Inside were items of power, a medicine bundle, sacred stones, and something that made her breath catch. A cradle board, intricately beaded, clearly old and cherished. "My grandmother made this," she whispered. "For my mother, then for me." She ran her fingers over the beadwork, patterns that told stories of her family line. Silas watched her, seeing new depths of emotion cross her face. "Your aunt seemed to think—" "Yes." Ayani looked up at him, something vulnerable and hopeful in her eyes. "Would you want children?" He moved to sit beside her, taking her hands. "With you, yes." She searched his face. "They would be half-breeds, not accepted by many in either world." "They'd be ours," Silas said firmly. "Raised with love, taught both ways, given choices we never had." That night, they made love with new purpose, new hope. The cradle board hung from a peg on the wall, waiting. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, but inside was warmth and possibility. Over the following weeks, life settled into new rhythms. Word of the trial verdict spread. And, surprisingly, some neighbors who'd shunned them before began to nod in greeting when they met on trails. Not friendship, not yet, but acknowledgement. Jacob Hensley, a rancher from the valley below, even stopped by one day. "Heard what you folks went through," he said awkwardly. "Took courage, what you did. My wife wanted you to have this." He handed over a bundle, preserves and fresh bread. "She says any woman who'd stand up like that deserves respect, Apache or not." Small gestures, but they added up. The world was changing, slowly, painfully, but changing. One evening in early December, Ayani stood suddenly from supper, her face pale. "What is it?" Silas asked, alarmed. She smiled then, a radiant expression that transformed her face. "Life," she said simply, placing his hand on her belly. New life. The winter that followed was one of preparation and joy. Silas carved a cradle while Ayani sewed tiny garments. They spoke of names, of dreams, of the world they wanted to create for this child who would bridge two peoples. "If it's a boy," Ayani said one snowy evening. "Samuel, for the one who couldn't live to see justice done. And if it's a girl, Mary." She smiled at Silas's surprised expression. "She was part of your journey to me, should be honored." As spring approached and Ayani grew round with child, they received another letter. The federal sentences had been upheld on appeal. Additionally, a fund had been established, pushed through by Webb and other progressive voices, to compensate Apache families for losses during the violence. It wasn't much, couldn't bring back the dead, but it was acknowledgement. "Sam would be amazed," Ayani said, reading the letter again. Apache words believed in white court, men punished for Apache deaths. Money paid for Apache losses. She shook her head. "The world really is changing." "Because of you," Silas said. "Your courage started this." "Our courage," she corrected. "I couldn't have done it alone." One morning, as the last snow melted and wildflowers began to push through the earth, Ayani woke Silas with a gentle shake. "It's time." The labor was long but uncomplicated. Silas had helped birth calves and foals, but this was different, sacred, terrifying, wonderful. Ayani was strong, drawing on traditions her grandmother had taught, breathing through the pains with focused determination. As the sun set, painting the mountains crimson and gold, their child entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to echo off the peaks themselves. "A daughter," Silas said, his voice broken with wonder as he placed the baby in Ayani's arms. "Mary," Ayani whispered, touching the infant's dark hair, her tiny, perfect fingers. "Mary Samuel Granger, child of two worlds." That night, as Ayani slept with the baby at her breast, Silas stepped onto the porch. The stars were brilliant overhead, and somewhere in the forest, an owl called. He thought of all that had brought them here, loss and pain, violence and injustice, but also love, courage, and now hope in the form of a tiny girl who would grow up knowing both her heritages. Movement caught his eye. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in moonlight, stood a figure. For a moment, Silas's hand moved toward his rifle. Then he recognized the stance, the proud bearing, Sam, or a trick of light and shadow that looked like him. The figure raised one hand, greeting or farewell, then faded into the forest. Silas stood there a long time, feeling the weight of the past and the promise of the future. Inside, his wife and daughter slept, safe and warm. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, raising a mixed-blood child in a world still learning tolerance, building a life that honored both traditions, continuing to fight for justice and understanding. But tonight, there was peace, the kind earned through blood and tears, testimony and truth, the kind that came from facing the worst and choosing love anyway. He went back inside, added wood to the fire, then climbed into bed beside his family. Ayani stirred, smiling without opening her eyes. "All well?" she murmured. "All well," he confirmed, wrapping his arms around both of them. Outside, snow began to fall again, late-season flurries that would melt by morning. But inside was warmth, was love, was hope for all the mornings yet to come. Spring arrived in full glory, painting the valley with wildflowers and filling the air with bird song. Little Mary was 3 months old now, a happy child with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. She had become the center of their world, bringing laughter to the cabin that had known too much sorrow. On a clear morning in May, Silas was splitting wood while Ayani worked in the garden, Mary sleeping in the cradle board hanging from a nearby tree. The rhythmic sound of the axe and the baby's gentle breathing created a peaceful symphony until it was broken by approaching horses. Silas reached for his rifle, old habits dying hard, then relaxed as he recognized Attorney Webb riding alongside a woman in traveling clothes. "Mr. Granger, Mrs. Granger," Webb called out. Dismounting, "I hope you'll forgive the unexpected visit. This is Mrs. Catherine Morrison." Silas went cold, Morrison's widow. His hand tightened on the axe handle as Ayani came to stand beside him, her face carefully neutral. The woman was younger than expected, with tired eyes and prematurely gray streaks in her brown hair. She looked at them nervously, then spoke in a rush. "I know you have no reason to receive me kindly. My husband. What he did was unforgivable. But I've come to ask, no, to beg your forgiveness." "Why?" Ayani's voice was steady but wary. "Mrs." Morrison twisted her hands together. "Because I can't live with the weight of it anymore. The lies he told, the hatred he spread, I knew, God help me, I knew and said nothing." Tears ran down her face. "I have children, Mr. Granger, 3 boys who are growing up believing their father was a hero killed by savages. I can't let them carry on his poison." Webb cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morrison has been instrumental in uncovering more evidence about her husband's activities. She's provided documents that have led to additional arrests. I'm returning to Ohio, Mrs. Morrison continued, to my family, to raise my boys away from this hate. But first, I needed to face you, to say how sorry I am, to ask if there's any way to make amends." Silas and Ayani exchanged a long look, years of shared understanding passing between them. Finally, Ayani stepped forward. "Your husband took much that can never be returned," she said softly. "But you are not him, and your boys are not him." She glanced at Mary sleeping peacefully. "Children should not carry their parents' sins." "Mrs." Morrison sobbed then, shoulders shaking. Ayani surprised everyone by reaching out to touch the woman's arm. "Go," Ayani said. "Raise your sons to be better men. That is how you make amends." After the visitors left, Silas and Ayani stood together in the dooryard, watching dust settle from their departure. "That was generous of you," Silas said. "Hate is poison." Ayani replied, "My grandmother's words, I won't drink it anymore. Won't pass it to our daughter." As summer deepened, life found new rhythms. Mary grew strong, laughing at everything, especially when Ayani sang Apache lullabies or when Silas made silly faces. They received occasional letters from Webb updating them on legal changes, small steps toward justice and recognition. One hot July day, they had unexpected visitors of a different sort. A small band of Apache, led by Ayani's aunt, arrived at the cabin. They'd left the reservation, seeking traditional summer grounds, and stopped to visit. "This is your niece," Ayani said proudly in Apache, presenting Mary. The old woman's face softened as she held the baby, singing a blessing song. The other Apache were cautious around Silas at first, but warmed as they saw how he deferred to their customs, how naturally he and Ayani worked together. That evening, they all shared a meal outside under the stars. Stories were told in both languages, translated back and forth. One young Apache man asked Silas directly, "Why do you live with our sister? Why not a white woman?" Silas considered his answer carefully. "Because she saw me truly, and I saw her. Because in her strength I found my own healing. Because love doesn't ask permission or follow rules." The young man nodded slowly, seeming to accept this. When the band left after 3 days, Ayani's aunt pulled her aside. You walk a hard path, child, but I see it is a good path. The little one will know both worlds. Perhaps she will help heal what has been broken. August brought news that shook them. Gold had been discovered in the Black Hills, sacred to the Sioux. War was coming again, bigger than before. It never ends, Ayani said bitterly, reading the newspaper account. Always something white men want on Indian land. Not all white men, Silas said gently. No, she agreed, touching his face. Not all. They prepared for potential trouble, but their valley remained peaceful. The cabin improvements continued. A larger room added for Mary. Better defenses just in case. Neighbors who had once shunned them now occasionally stopped by, drawn perhaps by curiosity about the tame Apache, or maybe by genuine neighborliness. Whatever the reason. Ayani met them with dignity, slowly changing minds one interaction at a time. In September, on the anniversary of the trial verdict, they rode to the high meadow where Silas had first taught Ayani to shoot his rifle. Mary rode in her cradleboard on Ayani's back, babbling happily. So much has changed, Ayani said, looking out over the valley. For the better? Yes. She dismounted, lifting Mary free. She will know a different world than we did, not perfect, but better. They spread a blanket in the meadow grass, letting Mary crawl and explore while they talked of the future. Plans for expanding the garden, maybe running some cattle, teaching Mary both Apache traditions and frontier skills. I want her to read, Ayani said, to write, to speak for herself like I learned to do. She will, Silas promised. And shoot straight, track game, know these mountains like her own heartbeat, a child of both worlds, strong in each. As they prepared to leave, Silas carved their initials into an aspen tree, S.G. plus A.G. with M.G. below. So she knows, he said, years from now, when she's grown, so she can come here and know her parents stood together in this place. October arrived with early snow and a letter that made Ayani cry. Good tears this time. The federal government had established a fund for education of Apache children, influenced by the testimony from the trials, not boarding schools designed to destroy culture, but day schools where children could learn while staying with families. Maybe there's hope, she whispered, holding the letter like treasure. One cold November evening, as they sat before the fire after putting Mary to bed, Silas pulled out a small wooden box. I made something, he said, suddenly shy. Been working on it while you thought I was carving trap parts. Inside the box lay a ring, carved from elk antler and inlaid with turquoise. We never had a proper wedding, he continued. I know Apache way is different, but I wanted you to have something that says to everyone, both worlds, that you're my wife, that I'm your husband, proper and legal and proud of it. Ayani took the ring with trembling fingers. It's beautiful. Marry me? He asked. Again, right and proper this time? Yes. She laughed through tears. Yes, stubborn man. They were married 2 weeks later by a circuit judge in Prescott, with Webb and his wife as witnesses. Ayani wore a dress that combined Apache and American styles, Mary in her arms. The judge, who'd presided over some of the trials, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. You two have been through more trials than most face in a lifetime, he said after pronouncing them man and wife. May the rest of your days be filled with peace. As they left the courthouse, legally wet in the eyes of both law and society, snow began to fall, soft, clean flakes that covered the mud and dust, making everything fresh. No more looking back, Silas said, helping his wife and daughter into the wagon. Only forward. Ayani agreed. They drove home through the falling snow, Mary sleeping between them, wrapped in blankets and love. The cabin appeared through the trees like a promise kept, smoke rising from the chimney, windows glowing with lamplight. Inside, they found a surprise. Neighbors had come while they were gone, leaving wedding gifts, preserves, smoked meat, a quilt stitched by the church women, even a rocking horse carved for Mary. Small gestures, but they spoke of acceptance, of community slowly embracing what had once been unthinkable. That night, as they lay together with Mary in her cradle nearby, Ayani traced the scars on Silas's chest, old wounds healed over but never forgotten. "We survived," she said softly. "More than survived. We lived. We loved. We changed things." "Yes." She kissed him gently. "And tomorrow? Tomorrow we keep living, keep loving, keep changing things." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing their valley in pristine white. But inside was warmth and light and the quiet breathing of a child who would grow up knowing both her heritages, proud of each, bridging worlds with every step. The fire burned low in the hearth, casting familiar shadows on walls that had witnessed sorrow and joy, violence and tenderness, endings and beginnings. In Mary's corner hung the cradle board beside a sampler Mary Granger had stitched years ago. Apache and American, past and present, woven together like the blanket that covered them all. Silas pulled Ayani closer, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, listening to their daughter's peaceful breathing. Through all the storms, literal and figurative, they had built something worth having. A family, a home, a future. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness. "And I love you," she whispered back. Forever and beyond. The wind sang through the pines, a lullaby older than memory, blessing the cabin and all who dwelt within. In the morning there would be chores and challenges, the ongoing work of living and building and raising a child between two worlds. But tonight, there was only peace, hard-won and precious, settling over them like new-fallen snow. The price had been paid in blood and tears, in courage and testimony. What remained was love, stubborn, enduring, triumphant love that had survived winter and would bloom again with every spring to come. In her cradle, Mary stirred and sighed, dreaming perhaps of the strong woman she would become, the bridges she would build, the stories she would tell. Above her, her parents held each other close, no longer alone, no longer afraid, no longer running. They were home. Thank you all for listening to this tale of love and survival in the Old West. I hope Silas and Ayani's story touched your hearts as it did mine. Where are you listening from today? Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories that bring the frontier to life. And share your thoughts about this journey. What moved you? What surprised you? What stays with you as the campfire dims? Until we meet again around the fire, partners, happy trails.